Hi guys, this is the first lecture in chapter 5, the second chapter in our syllabus. The first lecture in chapter 5, the second chapter in the syllabus, cost, volume, profit, relationships. Cost, volume, profit, relationships. Chapter 5, and we do have some assumptions for the chapter. To simplify the cost, volume, profit analysis, and we call it CVP analysis, CVP, which refers to cost, volume, profit analysis. To simplify the CVP calculations, managers typically adopt the following assumptions with respect to these factors. First, we will assume that the selling price for the company is constant. The price of a product or service will not change as volume changes. The second assumption, the costs are linear and can be accurately divided into variable and fixed components. The variable costs are constant per unit, and the fixed costs are constant in total over the entire relevant range. Just to remind you about the word linear, if you remember, when we draw the scatter plot for the XY, we just join each X point with the Y point, and then we draw a line between these dots. If we cannot draw a line, this means that the relationship is not linear, which means we cannot predict the X amount from the X amounts for the company. So this is the word linear, which means we can draw a line joining the majority of the points in the graph. Just to remind you about the word of variable and fixed, the total variable cost changes in regards with the outputs or the units of activity. So if we produce, then we will pay the total variable cost. It will increase gradually with the units of activity. The variable cost per 1 unit, if you remember when we explained the wood for a table, we will pay 5 JDs for a wood or 1 meter of wood for 1 table. Then the second table, I'm paying the same amount. The third table, I'm saying I'm paying the same amount. Then the variable cost per 1 unit will be constant for that. The variable cost per 1 unit will be constant, okay? And the total fixed cost is constant in total over an entire relevant range. Again, just to remind you that total fixed cost, like an example of rent, I will pay that much for the rent, regardless of how many products do I produce or units of activity happen in the company. So in total, the fixed cost will be constant. Again, the total, total fixed cost will be constant, but the fixed cost per 1 unit, if you remember from chapter 1, will be decreased or will decrease in regards of the units of activity. If we increase the units of activity, then the fixed cost per 1 will be less. The word of relevant range. Also, just to remind you what is the relevant range means. From the exercises that we did in chapter 1, if you remember, for exercise 1.7, 1.8, 1.9, we depend on the same information, same data for a company that produces 20,000 units, but they give me that the relevant range for that company is between 18,000 and 22,000. For that relevant range, I will pay the same fixed costs, okay? So if I produce 18 or 20 or 22, I will pay that much of the fixed costs. And go back for the exercises just to emphasize the word, the total fixed cost will be constant for that relevant range. If we exceed the relevant range, which means if we exceed the 22, if you remember, we will say that the company will follow a step shape fixed cost. Step shape means if I exceed the 22, I will jump to another level for the cost or the fixed cost, and it will last up to a point, let's say 26. After the 26, I will jump again in a step shape fixed cost, which means we are paying that much for that relevant range. If we exceed the relevant range, then we will pay a new level for the fixed costs. Okay. The second point is important because in a way it summarizes the whole chapter, the whole chapter 1, not this chapter. The third point for the assumptions: in the multi-product companies, the mix of products sold remains constant. And we'll explain what is the mix when we explain what is the meaning of the multi-product. And if we say 30-70, I will assume that this mix will be constant. If we sell 50-50 from product A and B, I will assume that this mix or percentages will be constant. Let's start for learning objective number 1 for this chapter. Explain how changes in sales volume affect contribution margin and net operating income. Something important that I emphasize in chapter 1, just to remind you about, is the contribution format income statement. Contribution format income statement, and as I told you before, we will use this format for chapter 5, chapter 13, and chapter 14, and also chapter 9, which is the budgets. So I will use the contribution income statement for further chapters, starting from this chapter. Just to remind you what is the contribution format income statement. This will start with the sales minus variable expenses, and the difference between the word sales and the variable expenses will equals to contribution margin. So again, just to emphasize the word, I'm contributing, which means I do have a control over the variable cost, but I don't have any control about the fixed cost up to a level, okay? Up to a relevant level. And then I will deduct all fixed expenses in order to calculate the net operating income. So basics for the cost volume profit analysis part 1. The contribution income statement is helpful to managers in judging the impact on profit of changes in the selling price, costs, or volume. The emphasis in or is on cost behavior. And if you like, the selling price is an important issue, and it will be, if you like, if we sell, then we will recognize revenues. If we didn't sell anything, the sales revenue will be 0 for the company. That's why it is important to be concluded in the contribution margin. The cost, which is the variable cost also, or number of units sold, also are important. The emphasis is on cost behavior. The contribution margin word, or CM, is the amount remaining from sales revenue after variable expenses has been deducted. So it is simply the difference between the sales revenue or sales minus the variable expenses will generate the contribution margin. The CM, or contribution margin, is used first to cover the fixed expenses. Any remaining contribution margin contributions or contributes to the net operating income. Okay, so I need to cover the 80,000 according to our example, and these numbers are given. I need to cover the 80,000 as fixed expenses, and after that I will cover the variable expenses in order to start to produce a profit. So for our example, I will use these numbers. The company sells 500 bicycles and the price is $500 for the company. So the total sales will be $250,000. $250,000. These numbers are given. Minus the variable costs. We sell 500 bicycles and the variable cost per one bicycle is 300. That's why the total is $150,000. The difference is called contribution margin, which is $100,000 minus total fixed cost for $80,000, and the difference will be the net operating income for $20,000. Sales, variable expenses, and contribution margin can also be expressed on a per unit basis, and I need to emphasize what is the contribution margin per 1 unit. So we need to understand what is the meaning of the price per unit, the variable cost per unit, and the difference is called the contribution margin per unit. So for this example, if the company sells an additional bicycle, a $200 additional contribution margin will be generated to cover the fixed expenses and profit. So the sales price or the selling price is $500. The variable cost per 1 unit is $300. So the contribution margin, if we are referring to the 1 unit, will be the price per 1 unit minus the variable cost per 1 unit, which equals to $200. This means that if the company sells an additional bicycle, 1 bicycle, the contribution for the net income will be $200. Each month, a company must generate at least $80,000 in total contribution margin to break even. And this is the main reason, main goal for the chapter is to explain what is the contribution margin and the break even means, which is the level of the sales at which the profit is 0. The break even means, again, the net operating to be 0. What is the point that the net income will be 0? Which means the contribution margin should cover and equals to the total fixed cost. So at least I need $80,000 in the contribution margin to cover the $80 of the fixed expenses. This means that the net operating income for the company will be 0. The 0 means that the company is in a situation of break even. So let's see how the company will break even, will recognize a net profit of 0. If the company sells 400 units, not in the previous example, we assume that the company sells 500 bicycles. So suppose that we are talking about 400 bicycles. 400 bicycles. Let's prepare the income statement again. The sales here will be, or sales revenue, again, I'm repeating the word just to emphasize that the sales is the same if we say sales revenue. The sales or sales revenue will be calculated from how many units do we sell? 400 units times the price per 1 unit, which is $500, and the total will be $200,000 total sales. Okay? Minus the total variable cost, and we are preparing the contribution format income statement. Total variable expenses, which means or refers to how many units do we sell, multiply by the variable cost per 1 unit. Total variable cost, again, referring to or depends on how many units do we sell. 400 units, multiply by $300, which is the variable cost per 1 unit. And the answer is $120,000. $120,000 is the total variable expenses. The difference between the sales revenue and the total variable expenses will be what? Will be the contribution margin. The difference between the sales revenue, which is $200,000, minus the total variable expenses or costs, which is $120,000, will equals to the contribution margin or total contribution margin. And the answer is $80,000, comes from the difference between $200,000 and $120,000. I will deduct again, or after that, the total fixed costs, which is given for the question or for this company, and this should be constant for the relevant range. So 80,000 contribution margin minus the total fixed expenses, which is also 80,000. This will give you the net operating income for zero. The net operating income for zero. The zero net operating income means what? In a title, it means a break-even point for the company. But if you think about the break-even point, means that the company is only able to cover the total costs. And also it is important to emphasize that the company are covering or is covering the total costs, means we are covering the fixed cost and the total variable cost. We are in a situation that we can cover the total fixed cost and total variable cost. In another way, the sales, which is 200,000, can cover both total costs, total fixed cost first, which is 80,000, and the total variable cost in this example, which is 120,000. The total will be also $2,000. So if the total revenues equals to the total costs, this situation called a break-even for the company. Break-even for the company means that the company recognizes zero profit or zero income. In this case, the contribution margin is equal to the fixed expenses in another way. Contribution margin is equal to the fixed expenses. Okay. In this case, the company sells 400 units only to break even, which means after the break even, the company can recognize the profit or the income. Up to 400 units, the company is able only to cover all expenses, fixed and variable. Let's see if we start to sell more than 400 units. The logic for the break-even point, as I say, after the break-even, the company can recognize a profit. Before the break-even point, the company is recognizing a loss, which means I have to sell 400 units in order only to break even, means to recognize a net profit income, a net operating income for zero. Okay, so before the break even means a loss, after the break even means a profit. Suppose that the company sells 401 bicycles, and keep in your mind that we do have a break even for the 400 units. Okay, we have a break even for the 400 units, and the company sells 401 bikes. So we can imagine that the company will recognize a profit after the 400 because the break even represents the 400. Okay, and after that we can calculate the profit for the total units sold from the company by preparing the income statement. But we do have a short method to calculate what is the profit recognized from the 401. It is simply all units sold after the break-even can contribute in the profit, referring or regarding or depending on the contribution margin for each unit. So simply I can say 401 contributes in the net income for only one unit. Why? Because up to the 400 I do have a net profit for 0. Okay, so the only one unit after the 400 can contribute to the net income. What is the contribution amount for this unit? It is simply the contribution margin or amount for that specific unit. Contribution margin for that unit is equal to the price minus the variable cost for that specific unit, which is 500 minus 300, which equals to $200. Now, if I understand the logic behind the break-even, I will say the company will contribute for an amount of $200 because we sell one additional unit more than the break-even, and the break-even means 0 profit. So I can say that the contribution margin per that unit is equal to 500 minus 300, and then the 200 is the additional amount contribution or contributes to the net operating income. We can do the income statement for the whole units. Again, 401 times the price, which is 500. This represents the sales, and the amount is $200,500. $200,500. This will be the sales amounts or volume for the whole units sold from the company, minus the total variable cost, and this is represented by 401 units to be sold or sold, multiplied by $300, and these numbers are given, $300, and the answer will be 120,300, 120,300, which is simply 401 units times $300 variable cost per one unit. This equals to 120,300. The difference between the sales and the total variable expenses, which represent the contribution margin, so 200,500 minus 120,300, this equals to 80,200. 80,200, this is the contribution margin for the company. We do have the total fixed costs for $80,000, then the net operating income will be 80,200 minus 80,000, and the answer is $200. So we can understand now what is the net operating income if we sell more than the break-even. The contribution margin for the one unit is $200, and simply we can say the net operating income contributes, or the one unit contributes for the net operating income for the contribution margin, which is $200. Okay, then accordingly, if I give you a number of units sold, then what is the net operating income for that company? The next example, we do not need to prepare an income statement to estimate profits at a particular sales volume. Simply multiply the number of units sold above the break-even by the contribution margin per one unit. And again, just to emphasize, we will move or recognize the profit beyond the break-even point. So suppose that I say the company is selling 430 units, we will say up to the 400, we don't have any profit because the company will break even for the 400 units, which means we will have a zero profit up to 400 units. After the 400, the company will recognize a profit. So we do have 30 units beyond the break even, and this means that the company can recognize a profit after the 400. Simply, we can calculate the profit from the 30 units beyond the break even, multiply by the contribution margin per 1 unit, which is $200. $200 is calculated from price for 1 unit minus variable cost for 1 unit. The price was, for our example, $500, and the variable cost per 1 unit was $300. So the contribution margin again is equal to the price minus the variable expenses for 1 unit or for the total. Now, the 30 units multiplied by $200, this equals to $6,000, and this will be the operating income for the company. 30 units multiplied by the contribution margin per 1 unit, which is $200, and this equals to $6,000. $6,000. If you like, we can prepare the income statement just to prove that we do have a $6,000 for the 430. Again, if you like, go back to prepare the income statement. Go back to prepare the income statement. Suppose that we do have 430. Let's go through in a hurry. For an income statement, if we sell 430 units. So for the sales, I will say just to prove what we have in the income. For the sales, we have 430 times $500. The price again is constant, okay? We don't have any discounts for the units or volume. So 430 times 500, this equals to $215,000. The total variable costs will be deducted from the sales, so less the total variable expenses. Total variable expenses, in this case, it will be 430, which is the number of units sold, times 300 is the variable cost per 1 unit. Okay, so 430 times 300, this will equals to 129,000. This will be deducted from the 215,000 sales, and the difference will equals to the contribution margin, and the answer will be $86,000. Okay. Now I will deduct less the total fixed expenses, total fixed costs or expenses. and this is given in the question for $80,000 and would not change that because of the relevant range. So the net operating income will be what? 86 minus 80, and this equals to $6,000. $6,000. So this is approved for the previous number. Go back to the how do we calculate the 6,000? The 6,000 here, we said that we need to simplify the calculation by beyond the 400, we are recognizing a profit. So the 30 units, each unit will contribute by $200. So 30 units multiplied by $200 is equal to $6,000. This will be the income for the company if they sell 430 bikes. The 400 is a break even, which means profit and loss is zero. The net operating income will be zero. And beyond the 400, we can recognize a profit. So simply 30 times 200. And for the income statement, look at the sales for 215,000. And this represents the whole 430 minus total variable cost, which is also represent the 430. And we do have a net operating income for $6,000. For $6,000. Okay, the contribution format income statement can be expressed in the following equation. Profit is equal to sales minus total variable cost minus fixed costs. Okay, it is the same of the income statement. If you look and compare the profit, which is sales minus variable expenses minus the fixed expenses or total fixed expenses. The sales is represented by units sold times the price. Total variable expenses are represented by units multiplied by variable cost per 1 unit. And the fixed is a fixed amount. It is not depending on the units sold because it is constant. So from our example, we do have 401, the last example, 401 multiplied by the price, which is 500 units. For the total variable cost, we do have 401 times 300, and the fixed cost is constant for $80,000. So the profit will equals to 200,500, which is 401 multiplied by 500, minus 120,300, which is 401 multiplied by 300, all minus the 80,000, and the profit is 200. When a company equation form, again, detailed breakdown for the equation form. When a company has only one product, we can further refine this equation as shown on this slide. Again, profit is equal between brackets sales minus variable expenses, all minus fixed expenses. The sales can be represented by what? Quantity sold, which refers to Q, multiplied by the sales or selling price per 1 unit, which is refers to P. So sales are equal to QP. And the variable expenses can be represented by quantity sold, Q, multiplied by variable expenses per 1 unit, which is V. So we can write it down as QV minus the fixed expenses. Look at the between brackets, we do have the Q in the sales and the variable expenses. So the if we apply the numbers, the equation can also be used to show the $200 profit for the company earns if it sells 401 bikes. The profit is equal to P is the $500. The Q is 401. So the P multiplied by Q, which is $500 multiplied by 401, minus the variable cost per 1 unit, which is $300, multiplied by 401 units, all between brackets, minus the fixed expenses, which is $80,000. Then the answer for the profit will be 200. This is important using the unit contribution margin. So all the equation here, just to emphasize that we can rewrite the equation by using the unit contribution margin. Unit contribution margin. We know that the unit contribution margin is equal to what? Selling price for 1 unit minus the variable expenses for 1 unit. So if it is often useful to express the simple profit equation in terms of the unit contribution margin, which is called CM or unit CM, as follows. The unit CM is selling price per 1 unit minus the variable expenses per 1 unit. So we can refer it by P minus V, okay? From our previous equation, we said that profits is equal to PQ or P times Q minus VQ, all minus fixed expenses. But we have the Q is a common factor here. So the Q multiplied by P minus V, all minus fixed expenses, still equals the profit. Q PV, which is the Q contribution margin per 1 unit minus the fixed cost, is equal to the profit. So we will use this equation, P or profit is equal to what? Contribution margin per one unit multiplied by Q, all minus total fixed costs, is equal to the profit. And remember that the unit contribution margin refers to price minus variable cost per 1 unit. If we apply our numbers here, then the unit contribution margin is 200 times the quantity that we are selling is 401 units, all minus total fixed costs, equals to the profit. So $200 contribution margin per unit multiplied by 401, this equals to $80,200. $80,200 minus total fixed expenses, which is 80,000. This equals to $200. This equation can also be used to compute the company's $200 profit if it sells 401 bikes. This is important. And simple. So we will use the equation form, but with the unit contribution margin, referring that or remembering that the unit contribution margin is equal to the price minus the variable cost per 1 unit. Learning objective number 2, and this is also very interesting. Prepare and interpret the cost volume profit CVP graph and the profit graph. We will use the graph in order to understand what is the break-even, and this is an interesting topic. The relationships in graphic form. The relationships among revenue or sales revenue, in this case, cost, profits, and volume can be expressed graphically by preparing the CVP graph, cost volume profit graph. Racing Bicycle developed contribution margin income statements at 0, 200, 400, and 600 units sold. We will use this information to prepare the CVP graph. So suppose that I'm giving you 4 different levels for the sales. Assume that the company is selling 0 units. Assume that the company is selling only 200 units, selling or sold 400 units, and the last assumption that the company is in a situation to sell 600 units. So if we prepare the income statement, if the company sold 0 unit, 0 unit means I'm not selling anything, which means the sales volume will be 0. For the first column, or the first income statement, if you like, if the company sells 0 units, so we don't have any sales revenue, we will not receive any sales revenue if we are not selling anything. Similarly, the total variable expenses will be also 0. Why? Because it is variable. Variable means if the company sells, I will pay according to, or just to remind you from chapter 1, the word variable cost means I will pay that cost if I have the units or the level of activity. If I don't have a level of activity, which means I will not pay that variable cost. To remind you about the definition of the variable cost, it will change in regards or in relationship with the level of activity. If I pay, if I do something, if I have a unit of activity, then I will pay that variable cost. Otherwise, it will be 0. Why? Because it is variable. And I'm talking about total variable expenses. So the sales will be 0. The total variable cost will be also 0. So we don't have any contribution margin, which is the difference between the sales and the total variable cost. But the total fixed costs, we still have to pay the total fixed costs for the company, regardless if I sell or not, regardless the number of the units sold, we still have to pay the $80,000 as a total fixed costs. Okay, so we do have an $80,000 in the total fixed cost. So the net operating income in this case, or the first case, or the first column, will be, we do have a loss for $80,000, which is 0 minus the fixed expenses 80,000, and the net operating loss in this case will be $80,000. Okay. The second income statement, if we sell 200 units only, 200 multiplied by the sales or selling price per one, which is $500. So 200 units times $500, this equals to $100,000 sales volume if we have 200 units sold. Similarly, the 200 units multiplied by $300 as a total or the variable cost per one unit, and this equals to $60,000. So the contribution margin will be $40,000. We have the total fixed expenses remains constant regardless of units sold for a number of $80,000. So we do have a net operating loss again for $40,000, which is calculated from contribution margin 40,000 minus the 80,000, which is the fixed expenses. This equals to $40,000 as a loss, which means we still need to sell more in order to break even. The third column, which is the 400 units. If the company sells 400, referring to the income statement that we prepared previously, the sales is $200,000, total variable expenses $120,000, contribution margin is $80,000, minus fixed expenses, which is $80,000, and the profit is zero. Zero means that the company is break even on the 400 units. So we have to sell 400 units in order to break even, means to recognize a profit of zero or not recognizing any profit or loss. And this is also important. If we sell more than 400, then the company will recognize a profit. So suppose for our example that the company is selling 600 units. If we prepare the income statement for the 600 units, then the 600 multiplied by $500 as a selling price, this equals to $300,000 as sales for that specific level. The total variable cost is calculated from 300 per unit multiplied by 600 units, and this equals to $180,000. The contribution margin is the difference between sales and total variable cost. This will equals to $120,000 minus the total fixed cost, which is constant, for $80,000. And by doing that, we are recognizing a profit of $40,000. The topic or learning objective number 2, we will use these 4 levels just to draw a graph representing the cost, volume, profit analysis or graph. Then, if we start to prepare the graph or the cost, volume, profit graph, the first step, we need to draw in the CVP graph, unit volume is usually represented by the horizontal, which is x-axis, and the dollars or the costs for the variable vertical y-axis. So we need to divide the x-axis into units for 100 or similar, and the cost in the y-axis or dollars in the y-axis for, let's say, 50,000 range dollars. The second step is to draw a line parallel to the volume of axis to represent the total fixed expenses. And this is the first step or the easiest step to say what is the total fixed cost for the company. It is $80,000. So we are drawing a constant line, straightforward line, parallel to the x-axis. Why? Because this number will not change constant for different levels of units. So if we sell 0, we still pay the $80,000. If we sell, go back to our example, if we sell 200, we still pay the $80,000. If we sell 400, we still pay the $80,000, and similar for the 600, we still pay the $80,000 as a fixed cost, So a line parallel to the x-axis will represent the total fixed cost. Okay. Second, or next, choose some sales volume, say 400 units, and plot the point representing the total expenses. The word total expenses means fixed and variable, and draw a line through the data point back to where the fixed expenses line interacts the dollar axis. Remember that the total cost line will start from the fixed expenses, not from the 0. This line starting from 0, which refers to the total variable cost only. If we are talking about the total cost, this will start from the line of the fixed cost. Okay. The next step, if you like, go back these numbers representing the total costs for different levels of units. The next step is choose some sales volume, say 400 units, and plot the point representing total sales. So go back to our example, we need to plot the zero. I'm talking about the sales volumes. So 0, 100,000, 200,000, and 300,000. Okay. But be careful, when we draw the total cost, we are referring to 80 plus the total variable cost. Okay. This represents the total cost. So for the first, it was 80. For the second, it was 80 plus 60. For the third, it was 80 plus 120. For the last one, it was 80 plus 180. Okay. To represent this line, which is the blue line representing the total cost. Now, the point that these two lines, which is total revenue and total cost, will be crossed is referring to the break-even point. Break-even point, which is referring to this point, represented by the 400. Look at the x-axis, the 400 units representing the break-even point, or the dollar sign, which is the $200,000 in sales. The 400 units or $200,000 in dollar sign or the y-axis. This is represented by 400 units times the price, which is $500. This equals to $200,000. The break-even point can be represented by units or by a dollar sign. The loss area, which is represented by the graph, the area before the break-even. Why? Because the total cost line, or the blue line here, is above than the total revenue. Then we do have a loss area. So from 0 units up to 400 units, we still recognizing a loss. After the break-even point, the company is starting to recognizing a profit. Why? Because the line of the revenue or the sales revenue is above the line of the total cost. So this area is called the profit area. The simple form here, we say the profit is unit contribution margin times Q, which is quantity, minus the fixed costs. An even simpler form for the CVP graph is called the profit graph. So look, the profit will be 0 for the point of 400 units, number of bicycles sold, 400, and the line will start from a loss. If we sell 0, we do have a loss for 60, for 80, okay, because the fixed expenses are 80,000, okay. The break-even point where profit is 0 is full. Use the contribution margin, learning objective number 3. Use the contribution margin ratio, CM ratio, to compute the changes in contribution margin and the net operating income resulting from the changes in the sales volume. Something interesting in this chapter, which is the contribution margin ratio. A contribution margin as a percentage of sales is referred to as the contribution margin ratio, CM ratio. CM ratio means that we are dividing by the base. Now, if I say CM ratio, which means the CM divided by the base, which is the sales in this case. So the CM ratio means the contribution margin divided by the sales as a total. For our company, the contribution margin ratio is calculated as follows. The CM referring to our example, $80,000 divided by $200,000 sales. This equals to 40%. 40%. Okay. For each $1 increase in sales results in a total contribution margin increased for 40 cents. So any increase in the sales for $1, this will cause the contribution margin to be increased for 40 cents. Why? Because the 40% is the contribution margin ratio. And this is the meaning of the contribution margin. Per 1 unit, the contribution margin ratio can also be calculated by dividing the contribution margin per unit by the selling price. The selling price referring or representing the sales for the whole units. So the contribution ratio for the unit equals the contribution margin per 1 unit divided by the selling price per 1 unit. For our example, the contribution margin was $200 divided by the price, which is $500, and this equals to 40% or 0.4. The variable expenses as a percentage of sales is referred to as a variable expense ratio again. And similarly, the ratio is computed as follows. Variable expenses ratio will be calculated from variable costs divided by sales. For our example, we do have $120,000 divided by $200,000 sales, and this equals to 60%. 60%. Having defined the two terms, it bears emphasizing that the contribution margin ratio and the variable expense ratio can be related to each other mathematically. So the contribution ratio, which is contribution margin divided by sales, the word contribution margin, which means the sales minus the variable expenses. So 1 minus variable expenses ratio, 1 minus 60%, which equals to 40%. Simply, the $1 in sales represented by 1 or 40 cents in contribution margin, 60 cents for the variable costs simply. So if we know the 1 referring to the selling price or the sales, the 40% referring to the contribution margin, keep in your mind that the contribution margin is equal to sales minus variable cost, or price minus variable cost per 1. So the 1 representing the price can be distributed into contribution margin on one hand, variable cost on the other hand. So 40% for the contribution margin, 60% for the variable cost. If the company increases sales from 400 to 500 bikes, we do have a 50,000 increase in the sales. Why? Because we do have 100 units multiplied by $500, which is the price. This equals to $50,000. For our example here, if we have 400 units or 500 units, the sales will be or will increase from $200 to $250,000. Variable expenses is also increased from $120,000 to $150,000. Again, just to remind you about the variable cost per 1 unit is equal to 300. So 300 times 400, Well, this equals 120,000, or 500 times 300, this equals to 150,000. Contribution margin will be 80 for the first case, 100 for the second case. Why? Because just to apply the contribution margin ratio, look at the 50,000 increase in the sales revenue results in 20,000 increase in the contribution margin. This can be calculated simply from $50,000 times the 40%, which is contribution margin ratio. This equals to 20,000 increase in the contribution margin. The fixed cost is constant, and then the net operating income will be 0 and 20,000 respectively. Just to finalize for today, a quick quiz. Coffee Clutch is an espresso stand in a downtown office building. The average selling price for the cup of coffee is $1.49. The price for one cup. The variable expenses per one cup is $0.36. The average fixed expenses per 1 month is $1,300, and this is constant, which is representing the total fixed expenses for the company. The average of 2,100 cups are sold each month. So the question is, what is the CM ratio? What is the contribution margin ratio for the company? This is simply calculated from what? The CM ratio can be calculated from contribution margin divided by sales, or for the given information in the company, in the example, we do have the contribution margin per one, or we can calculate it per unit, and the price per one. So the contribution margin ratio can be calculated from contribution margin per 1 units divided by the price, which is the base. So the contribution margin is equal to price minus variable cost per one, all divided by the price. So 1.49 minus 0.36, all divided by 1.49, and the answer will be 0.758. This will be the contribution margin ratio. Contribution margin ratio is calculated simply by the contribution margin per unit divided by price per unit. Okay. In another way, by the way, we can calculate it as contribution margin for the whole units divided by the sales for the whole units, but we need to multiply by the 2,100 for the price and the variable cost. Okay, and should be the same answer. The application for the contribution ratio increase in the sales volume, we will explain this topic for the next lecture in learning objective number 4. So let's stop for the beginning of learning objective number 4. Thank you for today. Thank you.